Let's start with a fact that should be more alarming than it apparently is. Almost every country on Earth is in debt. Not a little bit of debt. Not the kind of debt where you borrowed $20 from a friend and keep meaning to pay it back. Serious, large, growing, multi-trillion-dollar debt that in many cases has been accumulating for decades without any realistic plan to reduce it, let alone eliminate it. The United States owes approximately $34 trillion. Japan owes the equivalent of more than twice its entire annual economic output, a ratio so extraordinary that most economists who encounter it for the first time quietly wonder if someone made a spreadsheet error. France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Canada, the United Kingdom, all carrying debt levels that would have been considered fiscally irresponsible by the standards of any previous generation of economists and policymakers. Brazil is in debt, South Africa is in debt, India is in debt, Pakistan is in debt. Greece, which has been in debt crisis so many times that it has essentially become its entire economic identity, is still in debt. Even countries that you would expect to be financial paragons, Germany, Australia, Sweden, are technically in debt, though with the specific qualifier that their debt levels are more modest and their fiscal positions are more sustainable than the majority of their peers. The question this video is going to answer is not the one from the previous video. Who do countries owe the money to? That question is about the creditor side of the equation. This video is about the debtor side. Why? Why have virtually every government in the world accumulated debt? Why does the debt keep growing? What are the specific mechanisms that produce the consistent pattern of government spending more than they collect year after year, decade after decade, regardless of the political party in power, regardless of the economic conditions, regardless of the explicit stated policy commitment to fiscal responsibility that virtually every politician makes and virtually no government actually achieves? The answer involves economics, of course, but it also involves psychology, political science, democracy theory, institutional design, geopolitics, philosophy, and the specific human tendency to strongly prefer receiving things today over paying for them tomorrow. The story of why countries are in debt is, at its core, a story about human nature operating through the specific institutional structure of democratic government. And once you understand that story, the universality of the debt accumulation pattern stops being surprising and starts being entirely predictable. Some of what you're about to hear will make you nod in recognition. Some will frustrate you in the specific way that accurate descriptions of frustrating situations frustrate people. At least one part of it will make you look at the political process differently than you did before, possibly with more understanding, possibly with more exasperation, probably with both simultaneously. Let's start with the most fundamental question. Why do governments borrow money at all? Chapter 1. The basic logic. Why governments borrow in the first place? Here's the foundational question that needs to be answered before any of the more complex explanations of debt accumulation make sense. The specific reasons that governments borrow money rather than simply collecting enough taxes to pay for everything they want to spend money on. The answer is not complicated at the conceptual level. Governments borrow for the same basic reasons that individuals and businesses borrow, because there are specific situations where spending money now produces benefits that justify paying back more money later, and because the ability to smooth spending over time rather than being constrained by revenue in any given year provides valuable flexibility that pure pay-as-you-go financing cannot provide. But the government version of this logic is significantly more complex than the individual version, involves significantly larger sums, and operates within the specific institutional constraints of democratic politics that create specific incentives for borrowing that go well beyond the rational financial logic, the investment logic. When borrowing makes economic sense, here's the first and most defensible reason that governments borrow, the specific category of government expenditure where borrowing is not merely convenient, but is genuinely the economically rational financing approach. Infrastructure investment is the clearest example. A government that builds a bridge generates benefits, reduced travel time, lower transportation costs, improved economic connectivity, that flow to the users of the bridge over the bridge's entire useful life of 50, 70, or 100 years. If the government finances the bridge entirely, From current tax revenue in the year of construction, the current taxpayers bear the entire cost, while all future taxpayers and bridge users receive the benefits at no cost to themselves. This is the specific intergenerational unfairness of cash-basis financing for long-lived assets. Borrowing to finance the bridge is not merely convenient in this case. It is the specific financing approach that matches the cost to the benefit in a fair way across generations. The government issues 50-year bonds to finance the bridge. The bondholders receive interest payments over the 50 years of the bond's life, and the taxpayers who benefit from the bridge pay for it gradually through the taxes that service the debt. The generation that uses the bridge contributes to paying for it. The fairness argument for borrowing to finance long-lived public infrastructure is genuine and compelling. The same logic applies to other genuine public investments, the education spending that increases human capital and future productivity, the research and development investment that generates the technological innovations whose economic returns materialize over decades, the public health investment that reduces the disease burden that would otherwise reduce economic output for generations. The specific challenge is distinguishing genuine investment, spending that generates future economic returns that justify the borrowing cost, from current consumption that is dressed up as investment to justify borrowing. The new school is an investment. The additional public sector salary that keeps a government employee comfortable is consumption. The distinction seems obvious in the abstract and is frustratingly difficult to maintain in practice, particularly in democratic political systems where the pressure to spend on visible, immediate benefits is systematically stronger than the pressure to invest in less visible, longer-term payoffs. The stabilization logic, the Keynesian justification. Here's the second major reason governments borrow. The macroeconomic stabilization function, described first by John Maynard Keynes and subsequently endorsed, in various forms, by the mainstream of the economics profession. The core Keynesian argument is specific and has genuine intellectual support. During recessions, private sector spending declines because households and businesses are cutting back simultaneously, producing the specific paradox of thrift, where individually rational behavior produces collectively damaging outcomes. If every household reduces spending during a recession to rebuild its savings, the reduced consumer demand reduces business revenue, which reduces employment, which reduces household income, which reduces spending further, a self-reinforcing contractionary spiral. Government borrowing and spending during a recession injects demand into the economy from an external source. The government, which is not simultaneously trying to rebuild its balance sheet and can therefore maintain or increase spending when the private sector is retrenching. The borrowed money goes to unemployment benefits, public works projects, transfers to state and local governments, and other forms of spending that sustain demand during the downturn. The economy stabilizes more quickly than it would without the fiscal stimulus. The specific logic for borrowing rather than financing this stimulus through current taxes is compelling. You cannot raise taxes during a recession without making the recession worse, because additional taxation removes exactly the private sector demand that you're trying to sustain. The countercyclical fiscal policy that stabilizes the economy must be financed by borrowing. The alternative is either procyclical taxation that deepens the recession or no fiscal stabilization at all. The Keynesian logic is intellectually coherent, and the empirical evidence that fiscal stimulus reduces recession depth and duration is reasonably strong. The specific problem is the political economy of the Keynesian prescription's second half, the requirement to run surpluses during expansions to repay the deficits accumulated during recessions. Governments have proven extraordinarily good at the borrow during downturns half of the Keynesian program, and consistently terrible at the repay during upturns half. The result is the specific ratchet pattern where debt grows during every recession and then fails to shrink adequately during the subsequent expansion. The wartime logic, the original justification for extraordinary borrowing. Here's the third and historically most important reason governments have borrowed: the specific emergency of war that requires mobilizing resources at a scale and speed that normal taxation cannot provide. Wars are expensive, sudden, and outcome determinative. A country that waits to accumulate sufficient tax revenue before beginning to build its military capacity will be defeated by the country that borrows immediately and builds the military capacity now. The specific temporal asymmetry of wartime finance, You need the resources now. The war will determine whether you survive to pay back the debt, makes borrowing not merely convenient, but essential. The history of government debt is, in large part, a history of wars. The British national debt, which has been continuously outstanding since 1694, making it the oldest surviving government debt in the world, was originally created to finance William III's war against France. The United States' first significant government debt was created to finance the Revolutionary War. The extraordinary debt levels of the mid-20th century, the United States at 120% of GDP, the United Kingdom at over 250% of GDP, were the specific financial legacy of two world wars within a generation. The specific logic for wartime borrowing is the same investment logic described above, with the added urgency of existential stakes. The spending generates a benefit, national survival, that extends indefinitely into the future, justifying the indefinite intergenerational burden of the debt that finances it. Chapter 2. The Political Economy. Why Democratic Governments Systematically Overspend. Here's the chapter that moves from the legitimate economic justifications for government borrowing to the specific political mechanisms that produce the consistent pattern of governments borrowing more than any economic justification supports, the specific ways that democratic political systems create incentives for deficits that exist independent of wars, recessions, or investment opportunities. The observation that most governments in democratic countries run persistent deficits, spending more than they collect in taxes in most years regardless of the economic conditions, is one of the most robustly documented patterns in political science. It is not occasional. It is not the result of unusual circumstances. It is the systematic, predictable outcome of specific incentives that democratic political structures create for the politicians who operate within them. The electoral cycle problem, the specific timing that makes politicians borrow. Here's the most fundamental political mechanism that produces government deficits: the specific temporal misalignment between the benefits of spending, immediate and visible, and the costs of paying for that spending, delayed and diffuse. Every politician in every democratic system faces the same basic calculation: the benefits of government spending, the services delivered, the jobs created, the infrastructure built, the welfare benefits distributed, are visible, immediate, and attributable. The constituents who receive these benefits know they received them, know which government delivered them, and vote accordingly. The costs of financing that spending through taxation are equally visible, immediate, and attributable. Taxpayers know their taxes increased, know which government raised them, and vote accordingly, but in the opposite direction. Tax increases are electorally painful in a direct and immediate way, that spending cuts are also painful, but that borrowing is not. The cost of financing spending through borrowing is diffuse, delayed, and not attributable in any politically salient way. The future taxpayers who will service the debt being accumulated today are not voting in today's election. They may not have been born yet. They certainly cannot organize and lobby against the specific borrowing decision that is creating their future obligation. The current generation of voters experiences the full benefit of the spending, and none of the specific immediate cost of the borrowing. The cost arrives later, in the form of higher taxes or reduced services to service the accumulated debt, and it arrives in a form that is difficult to attribute, specifically to the borrowing decisions made years or decades earlier. This temporal asymmetry is the specific mechanism that makes deficit financing politically superior to tax financing for any given spending decision from the perspective of an elected official who wants to maximize current political support, spend today, borrow to pay for it, and let future politicians and future taxpayers deal with the accumulated consequences, the concentrated benefits, diffuse costs problem. Here's the second political mechanism that systematically produces government deficits: the specific asymmetry in how the benefits and costs of government spending programs are distributed across the electorate. Most government spending programs produce concentrated benefits for specific identifiable groups and diffuse costs spread across the entire tax-paying population. Agricultural subsidies produce large benefits for farmers, a small, identifiable, well-organized group, and tiny costs for each taxpayer, a large, dispersed, poorly organized group for whom the cost of any individual subsidy program is too small to motivate specific political action. Defense contracts produce large benefits for defense industry employees in specific congressional districts and tiny per capita costs for the general taxpayer. Infrastructure projects produce large benefits for the local economy where the project is located and tiny costs for the general taxpayer. The political logic of this asymmetry is specific and well understood. The concentrated beneficiary group has strong incentives to organize politically, to lobby for the spending program, to donate to campaigns, to vote specifically on the basis of the program's continuation. The diffuse taxpayer majority has weak incentives to organize against any individual spending program. The cost to each taxpayer is too small to justify the effort of specific political opposition, even though the aggregate cost across all taxpayers is large. The result is the systematic political pressure to add spending programs, each individually justifiable by the organized interests that benefit from it, without the corresponding political pressure to eliminate programs or raise the taxes that would finance them. The political equilibrium produces more spending than the aggregate of individually justified programs, financed by deficits rather than by taxes that would activate the diffuse majority's opposition. The spending ratchet. Why spending is easy to add and impossible to remove. Here's the third mechanism that produces persistent deficits: the specific asymmetry between the ease of adding government spending programs and the difficulty of removing them once established. The specific political science observation is this: new spending programs create immediate beneficiaries who have strong incentives to defend the program, while the elimination of the same program would produce diffuse benefits, slightly lower deficits or taxes for the general public that are insufficient to motivate strong political support for elimination. The constituency for a spending program is always more politically active than the constituency for the program's elimination. This is the spending ratchet, the mechanism that allows spending to increase in both good times and bad times, for both ideological and pragmatic reasons, while making equivalent reductions in spending politically nearly impossible. New programs are added during expansions because we can afford it. New programs are added during recessions because we need the stimulus. The programs accumulate, the baseline spending level ratchets upward, and the gap between the accumulated spending commitments and the revenue available to finance them is bridged by borrowing. The politician's rational self-interest, the perverse incentive structure. Here's the specific individual level incentive that makes the political economy of deficits so difficult to change through normal political processes. The specific calculation that a rational, self-interested politician makes when deciding whether to support deficit spending or fiscal discipline. A politician who supports spending cuts and tax increases to reduce the deficit is making a specific political sacrifice. They are imposing visible, immediate costs on identifiable groups of constituents in exchange for the diffuse, delayed, difficult to attribute benefit of a reduced future deficit. The constituents who are harmed by the cuts will vote against the politician in the next election. The constituents who will benefit from the reduced future deficit are either not born yet or are too dispersed and too focused on immediate concerns to organize specific political support for the politician's fiscal discipline. A politician who supports deficit spending is making the opposite calculation. They are delivering visible, immediate benefits to identifiable constituents whose votes and donations they will receive, while imposing diffuse, delayed, difficult to attribute costs on future taxpayers who are not voting in today's election. The rational self-interest calculation, from the perspective of a politician whose primary goal is re-election, strongly favors deficit spending. This is not a description of corruption or immorality. It is the specific outcome of an incentive structure that produces fiscally irresponsible behavior from individually rational actors operating within a democratic system. The politician who maintains fiscal discipline is not virtuous in a way that voters particularly reward. They are simply imposing costs on identifiable people in exchange for diffuse benefits that are too abstract to generate political support. Chapter 3. The structural drivers, the deep forces that make debt grow. Here's the chapter that moves beyond the political incentive structure to the specific structural, economic, and demographic forces that make government debt grow, the forces that would produce fiscal pressure even if politicians were perfectly willing to make difficult choices, even if voters were fully informed about the long-run consequences, and even if the institutional design of government were optimized for fiscal sustainability. These structural drivers are in many ways the most important part of the story, because they explain why debt accumulation is not merely the product of bad political incentives or poor democratic design, but is the specific outcome of fundamental forces in modern developed economies that produce expenditure pressures that revenues struggle to match. The Baumol cost disease. Why government gets more expensive faster than everything else. Here's the specific economic phenomenon that produces persistent upward pressure on government spending. The Baumol cost disease, which is simultaneously one of the most important and least discussed forces in fiscal policy. William Baumol, the Princeton economist, observed in the 1960s that productivity growth in the economy is highly uneven. Some sectors experience dramatic productivity improvements over time, while other sectors experience minimal productivity improvement. In manufacturing, the number of cars a worker can produce in a day has increased exponentially through automation, process improvement, and technological innovation. In a string quartet, the number of musicians required to perform a Beethoven string quartet is the same today as it was in Beethoven's time. 4 musicians, 40 minutes of music, no productivity improvement possible. The specific economic consequence: in a competitive labor market, wages tend to equalize across sectors. The wages of the musicians in the string quartet must rise over time to keep pace with the rising wages available in the manufacturing sector. Otherwise, no one would become a musician when the factory job pays so much more. But the string quartet's productivity hasn't increased, so every increase in musician wages directly increases the cost of a string quartet performance. The performing arts sector experiences persistent cost inflation driven not by inefficiency, but by the specific dynamics of productivity-driven wage convergence. Government provides services that are predominantly in the low productivity growth category: healthcare, education, social services, public safety. A doctor cannot see twice as many patients per day because of automation. A teacher cannot educate twice as many students simultaneously without sacrificing educational quality. A police officer cannot respond to twice as many incidents in a given period. These are inherently labor-intensive services where the productivity gains available in manufacturing and technology are structurally unavailable. But the workers who provide these government services, nurses, teachers, police officer, compete in the same labor market as workers in higher productivity sectors. Their wages must rise to remain competitive, even though their productivity is not increasing proportionally. The result is a persistent tendency for government services to become more expensive relative to GDP over time. The government must devote a growing share of GDP to maintain the same quantity and quality of public services. The specific fiscal implication: if government services become 1% more expensive relative to GDP each year due to Baumol's disease, maintaining constant public service provision requires either a 1% annual increase in taxes or a 1% annual increase in deficit spending. Across the range of services that modern governments provide, healthcare, education, social care, the Baumol cost disease creates a structural fiscal pressure that drives spending upward faster than economic growth can sustain without either growing deficits or declining service quality. The demographic tsunami, the fiscal consequences of population aging. Here's the single most important structural driver of government debt growth in developed economies: the demographic shift toward older populations that is simultaneously reducing the tax base and increasing the expenditure demands on government budgets. The demographic structure of most developed economies is undergoing a transformation that has been visible in the data for decades and is now producing the specific fiscal consequences that demographers have long predicted. The baby boom generation, the extraordinarily large cohort born in the years following World War II, is now retiring. As this generation exits the workforce and enters the retirement phase of life, the ratio of workers to retirees, the dependency ratio, is shifting in a direction that is financially very challenging for governments. The specific fiscal mechanism: every retiree who leaves the workforce simultaneously reduces government revenue and increases government expenditure, they pay less in income taxes because they have less employment income. They generate less in payroll taxes because payroll taxes are assessed on employment earnings. They may receive government pension benefits that represent a cash expenditure. They consume healthcare at significantly higher rates than younger people. The specific cost of healthcare increases dramatically with age, with the last year of life being by far the most expensive medically, generating healthcare expenditure that is financed through government health insurance programs. The scale of this demographic transition in developed economies is extraordinary. Japan already has 30% of its population over 65, the specific demographic structure that produces the most acute fiscal pressure. Germany, Italy, Spain, South Korea, and Canada are following similar demographic trajectories. The United States is on a less extreme but still significant aging path, with the Social Security system projected to face funding shortfalls within the next decade as the baby boom retirement proceeds. The arithmetic of the demographic fiscal pressure is straightforward and unforgiving. If a government provides pension benefits of $20,000 per year and healthcare averaging $15,000 per year to each retiree, and the retiree-to-worker ratio doubles over 20 years, the per-worker cost of supporting the retired population doubles over the same period. The specific options for addressing this pressure are limited: raise the retirement age, reduce pension benefits, raise payroll taxes, or borrow to cover the gap. All options are politically painful, which is why most developed economies have borrowed rather than fully implementing the adjustments required to maintain fiscal balance in the face of demographic change. The interest rate trap: when debt feeds itself. Here's the specific mathematical mechanism through which accumulated debt generates additional debt. The interest rate trap that converts a manageable debt to GDP ratio into an increasingly difficult one to control. Government debt generates interest costs. The government must pay bondholders the interest promised when the bonds were issued, the coupon payment that makes the bond attractive to investors. This interest cost is a mandatory expenditure. It cannot be postponed without triggering default. That competes with every other government expenditure priority. The specific arithmetic: if a government has debt equal to 100% of GDP and the interest rate on that debt is 5%, the interest cost alone is 5% of GDP. If the government's total revenue is 35% of GDP, a typical figure for a developed economy, then 5 percentage points of that revenue, or approximately 14% of total government revenue, is consumed by debt interest payments before the government can spend a single dollar on healthcare, education, defense, or any other program. The interest cost is a first claim on revenue that grows larger as the debt grows and as interest rates rise. The self-reinforcing dynamic: if a government is running a deficit, spending more than it collects, the deficit itself adds to the debt. The growing debt generates growing interest costs. The growing interest costs add to the deficit. The deficit in large debt generates still more interest costs. This is the specific debt spiral that fiscal theory identifies as the unstable equilibrium. The specific combination of debt level, interest rate, and primary deficit that produces accelerating rather than stable debt to GDP trajectories. The specific reason interest rate changes can dramatically alter the fiscal situation. During the 2010s, when interest rates were near zero in most developed economies, the interest cost of large government debts was surprisingly manageable. The United States could carry $20 trillion in debt at 1.5% average interest and pay approximately $300 billion per year in interest costs. At 5% average interest on the same debt, the annual interest cost would be $1 trillion. A $700 billion difference in annual fiscal burden from the same nominal debt level. The transition from the low-rate era of the 2000s to the higher-rate environment of the 2020s has produced precisely this fiscal shock across the developed world, dramatically increasing the interest cost share of government budgets without any change in the nominal debt level. The healthcare inflation spiral, the expenditure that grows faster than everything. Here's the specific expenditure category that combines the Baumol cost disease with the demographic pressure to produce the fastest growing component of government spending in most developed economies: healthcare. Healthcare expenditure is the product of three simultaneously upward trending forces. The demographic force, more retirees, higher healthcare consumption per retiree, more years of retirement age healthcare consumption as life expectancy increases. The technological force, the continuous development of new medical technologies, new drugs, new procedures, and new treatments that extend life and improve health outcomes, but at costs that previous generations never incurred. The specific capability inflation of modern medicine that makes each year of healthcare more expensive than the previous one as new treatments become available and become the standard of care. The Baumol force. Healthcare delivery is inherently labor-intensive, so the wages of healthcare workers must rise with the broader economy even as their productivity increases only modestly. The specific fiscal consequence? Government healthcare expenditure has been growing faster than GDP in most developed economies for most of the past 50 years. In the United States, Medicare and Medicaid combined now cost more than Social Security. In the United Kingdom, the National Health Service consumes an ever-growing fraction of government revenue. In Germany, France, and other European countries with comprehensive public health systems, healthcare spending as a fraction of GDP has been on a persistently upward trend. The specific difficulty of controlling healthcare cost growth: every healthcare expenditure is someone's treatment. Reducing healthcare cost growth requires either delivering less care, delivering the same care less expensively, or changing the specific incentive structures that drive overtreatment, inefficiency, and waste in healthcare delivery. None of these approaches is easy, and all of them create politically organized opposition from the specific groups whose interests are served by current healthcare spending levels: providers who deliver the care, pharmaceutical companies that produce the treatments, insurance companies that process the payments, and patients who receive the services. Chapter 4: The Revenue Problem. Why governments can't simply collect more. Here's the chapter that addresses the other side of the fiscal equation. Not why spending grows, but why revenue consistently fails to keep pace with it, and the specific mechanisms that prevent governments from simply solving their debt problem by collecting more taxes. The naive solution to persistent government deficits is obvious. If the government spends more than it collects, collect more. Raise taxes until the deficit closes. The gap between spending and revenue is the problem. Increasing revenue is the solution. Case closed. The specific reason this solution is less straightforward than it appears involves economics, behavior, politics, and the particular international environment of the modern global economy, all of which create specific constraints on how much revenue a government can realistically collect without producing consequences that offset the revenue gain. The Laffer curve reality, where taxation stops working. Here's the specific economic concept that captures the fundamental constraint on government revenue: the Laffer curve, which is simultaneously one of the most misused ideas in political discourse and one of the most genuinely important observations in public finance. The core observation is not controversial among economists. At a tax rate of 0, the government collects no revenue. At a tax rate of 100%, the government also collects no revenue, because no rational person will work, invest, or produce anything if the entire proceeds are confiscated. Between 0 and 100% lies the specific range of tax rates that produce positive revenue, with the revenue first rising as rates increase and then declining as rates become sufficiently high that the behavioral responses, reduced work, reduced investment, shifted income, tax avoidance, capital flight, reduce the taxable base faster than the rate increase expands it. The specific and genuinely difficult empirical question is where the revenue maximizing tax rate is for any given tax base. The political right tends to assume the current rate is already on the wrong side of the peak. The political left tends to assume there is substantial room to raise rates before revenue declines. The honest empirical answer is that it depends enormously on the specific tax, the specific country, the specific time period, and the specific behavioral responses of the taxpayers involved. What is clear from the evidence is that there are real behavioral responses to high marginal tax rates that reduce the taxable base. High marginal income taxes reduce the incentive to work additional hours, to seek promotions, and to take entrepreneurial risks. High corporate taxes create incentives to shift profits to lower tax jurisdictions. High capital gains taxes reduce the frequency of asset sales. locking in unrealized gains rather than realizing them and triggering the tax. High payroll taxes increase the cost of employment, reducing hiring, and pushing some employment into informal arrangements that escape the tax entirely. These behavioral responses are the specific mechanism that creates the practical ceiling on government revenue, the specific point beyond which additional tax increases produce diminishing and eventually negative returns. The ceiling is real, even if its precise location is contested. The tax competition problem. The race that nobody wins. Here's the specific international dimension that has dramatically reduced government's practical ability to raise revenue over the past 4 decades. The tax competition between countries that has made capital, corporate profits, and high-income individuals increasingly mobile and increasingly difficult to tax. In a world of limited capital mobility, the world that existed before the liberalization of international capital flows in the 1970s and 1980s, a country could set its corporate tax rate at 50% without dramatically affecting the location. Decisions of businesses moving a factory across a border was expensive, complicated, and slow. The capital was not particularly mobile, so the tax had to be paid. In the world of high capital mobility that has developed since financial liberalization, a world where capital flows freely across borders at the click of a button, where multinational corporations can shift profits to low-tax jurisdictions through the specific legal mechanisms of transfer pricing and intellectual property licensing, where wealthy individuals can establish legal residency in low-tax jurisdictions without meaningfully changing their lifestyle, the competitive dynamics of corporate and capital taxation have changed fundamentally. The specific mechanism: if country A raises its corporate tax rate to 35%, while country B maintains a 12.5% rate, multinational corporations have strong incentives to structure their operations to book profits in country B rather than country A. The intellectual property that generates the company's profits can be held in an Irish subsidiary. The headquarters can be registered in Luxembourg. The intercompany transactions can be priced to shift income from high-tax to low-tax jurisdictions. The actual employees who do the actual work remain in country A, but the profits appear in country B. The result is the specific race to the bottom in corporate taxation that has characterized the past 40 years of international tax policy. The global average corporate tax rate has fallen from approximately 40% in the 1980s to approximately 23% today. Every individual country's reduction in its corporate rate was a rational response to the competitive pressure created by other countries' lower rates. But the collective outcome of individually rational tax rate reductions is a global reduction in corporate tax revenues that has contributed directly to the fiscal pressure that produces deficits. The OECD's Global Minimum Tax Agreement, the specific effort to establish a 15% global minimum corporate tax rate that would reduce the incentive for profit shifting, represents the first serious multilateral attempt to address this race to the bottom. Its implementation is the specific ongoing policy experiment that will determine whether the international community can coordinate sufficiently to partially reverse the 4-decade trend of corporate tax competition. The informal economy, the revenue that governments cannot capture. Here's the specific dimension of the revenue problem that receives the least attention in developed country fiscal discussions and the most attention in developing country ones: the informal economy that generates economic activity and income that escape the tax system entirely. Every economy has an informal sector, the portion of economic activity that is not registered, not reported, and not taxed. In developed economies, the informal sector is estimated to constitute approximately 10% to 20% of GDP. The cash-in-hand plumber who doesn't report all income, the babysitter paid in cash, the small business that underreports sales, the freelancer who doesn't declare all earnings. In developing economies, the informal sector can be substantially larger. In some African and South Asian economies, estimates put the informal sector at 40% to 60% of total economic activity. The specific consequence for fiscal capacity: a government that can only access the formal sector for taxation is collecting revenue from 40% to 60% of the economy while providing services to 100% of the population. The arithmetic of sustainable fiscal policy is impossible under these conditions without either dramatically expanding the formal sector, dramatically reducing services, or borrowing indefinitely. The specific difficulty of formalizing the informal sector, the barriers to formalization are not merely administrative, they include the specific costs of regulatory compliance that make formal operation prohibitively expensive for small informal enterprises, the specific trust deficit in government institutions that makes informal operators reluctant to become visible to tax authorities, and the specific network effects of informal economic relationships that make informal sectors self-sustaining once they reach a critical mass. The complexity trap. When the tax system works against itself. Here's the final dimension of the revenue problem. The specific way in which the accumulated complexity of modern tax systems creates opportunities for avoidance and evasion that reduce the revenue the system was designed to collect. A simple tax system, a flat rate applied to a broad base with no exemptions, collects revenue efficiently because there is nothing to exploit. Every dollar of income is taxed at the same rate. Every asset is treated the same way. Every transaction generates the same tax obligation. The specific efficiency of simplicity. Real tax systems are not simple. They are the accumulated product of decades of politically motivated additions, exemptions for specific industries, credits for specific behaviors, deductions for specific expenses, preferential rates for specific income categories, each justified at the time of enactment by specific policy rationales, and each creating specific opportunities for exploitation by sophisticated taxpayers. The mortgage interest deduction in the United States reduces tax revenue while primarily benefiting higher income homeowners who have larger mortgages. The carried interest provision reduces the tax rate on investment manager compensation below what ordinary income would bear. The step-up in basis at death eliminates capital gains tax on appreciated assets held until death, creating specific incentives for wealthy families to hold assets indefinitely rather than selling and reinvesting. Each of these provisions has specific constituencies that defend its continuation. Aggregate revenue cost of all such provisions, what the Treasury calls tax expenditures, amounts to approximately $1.5 trillion per year in the United States, a sum that exceeds the entire deficit and that represents the specific revenue that the stated rates would collect if applied to the stated base without the accumulated exceptions. The complexity is self-reinforcing. Each new exemption creates an incentive to restructure transactions to qualify for the exemption. The restructuring creates new revenue leakage. The new leakage motivates new anti-avoidance rules. The new rules create new complexity that generates new avoidance opportunities. The tax code grows more complex, the compliance cost rises, the avoidance opportunities multiply, and the effective revenue collected falls further below what the nominal rates would suggest. Chapter 5. The Illusion of Fiscal Discipline. Why Rules Don't Work. Here's the chapter that addresses the specific attempts that governments have made to constrain their own borrowing through formal rules, the balanced budget amendments, the debt breaks, the Maastricht criteria, the Fiscal Responsibility Acts, and the specific reasons these rules consistently fail to achieve their stated purpose of preventing deficit accumulation. The story of fiscal rules is the story of what happens when democratic governments try to tie their own hands against the political incentives that produce deficits, and the specific ingenuity that those same governments apply to untying those hands when the rules become inconvenient. The European Stability and Growth Pact, the most famous fiscal rule that failed. Here's the specific historical case study that most clearly illustrates both the appeal and the limits of formal fiscal rules. The European Union's Stability and Growth Pact, which was designed to prevent the fiscal irresponsibility that might undermine the euro and which has been violated, suspended, or reinterpreted so many times that its original constraints bear only a theoretical relationship to the actual fiscal behavior of its supposed adherents. The Stability and Growth Pact, established in 1997 as a condition of Eurozone membership, imposed two specific fiscal constraints on member states. The annual budget deficit must not exceed 3% of GDP, and the total government debt must not exceed 60% of GDP or must be declining at a satisfactory pace toward that level. The specific logic was compelling. Countries sharing a common currency needed to maintain fiscal discipline because irresponsible spending by one member could create inflationary pressure or financial instability that affected all members. The specific reality, Germany and France, the two largest Eurozone economies, and the countries most responsible for designing the pact, were among the first to breach the 3% deficit limit in 2003 when their economies weakened. Their response to the breach was not the correction the pact required, but the specific political pressure that resulted in the excessive deficit procedure against them being suspended. The precedent was devastating. The two architects of the rule had demonstrated within 6 years of its establishment that the rule would not be enforced when enforcement was inconvenient for powerful members. The subsequent history of the Stability and Growth Pact is a catalog of formal compliance through creative accounting, genuine breaches that were tolerated, emergency suspensions during crises, and the specific irony that the countries whose fiscal positions were most problematic, Greece, Italy, Portugal, were the least capable of generating the political pressure needed to suspend enforcement, while the countries whose positions were most sustainable were the ones who established the precedent that enforcement could be set aside. The balanced budget amendment, the constitutional solution that creates its own problems. Here's the specific institutional response to fiscal indiscipline that has the strongest intuitive appeal and the most serious practical problems: the balanced budget amendment that would constitutionally prohibit deficit spending and force the government to live within its means. The appeal is genuine and easy to articulate. If politicians cannot resist the temptation to spend more than they collect, remove the ability to borrow rather than trying to improve the politicians' willpower, make it constitutionally impossible to run deficits, force the government to match its spending to its revenue in every year, just as a household must match its consumption to its income. The specific practical problems are multiple and serious. First, the timing problem. Tax revenues are highly cyclical. They rise during expansions and fall sharply during recessions, because income, profits, and consumption all decline during downturns. If a government is constitutionally required to balance its budget in every year, a recession that reduces revenues by 15% would require an immediate 15% reduction in spending, which would be achieved through spending cuts that remove exactly the purchasing power the private sector is already cutting, amplifying the recession rather than stabilizing it. The balanced budget amendment converts the government from a macroeconomic stabilizer into a macroeconomic destabilizer, making recessions deeper by requiring procyclical fiscal tightening precisely when countercyclical stimulus is most needed. Second, the definitional problem. Balanced budget sounds simple, but requires the specific definition of what counts as a budget expenditure and what counts as budget revenue. Definitions that governments can and will manipulate to comply formally while continuing to spend more than they collect in any economically meaningful sense. Capital expenditures can be moved off balance sheet. Future obligations can be structured as contingent liabilities that don't appear in current budget calculations. Public-private partnerships can be used to finance spending through private borrowing guaranteed by the government without showing up in the official deficit. The specific creativity that fiscal authorities apply to meeting formal rules while evading their substance is essentially unlimited. Third, the emergency problem. Wars, pandemics, and natural disasters create sudden, large, legitimate expenditure needs that cannot be financed from current revenue without either imposing devastating immediate tax increases or cutting all other government spending to zero. Every balanced budget amendment that has been seriously proposed includes emergency provisions, typically allowing deficit spending during declared national emergencies. These emergency provisions become the specific escape valve that governments use to circumvent the amendment's constraints whenever the constraints become inconvenient. The fiscal council solution: independent referees and their limits. Here's the specific institutional innovation that has shown the most genuine promise as a partial constraint on fiscal indiscipline: the Independent Fiscal Council that monitors government fiscal projections, assesses fiscal sustainability, and publicly identifies when official projections are unrealistic. The United Kingdom's Office for Budget Responsibility, established in 2010, is the specific model that has been most widely imitated. The OBR independently evaluates the Treasury's fiscal projections, assessing whether the government's forecast of revenue, spending, and debt is consistent with the economic assumptions it states and with the stated fiscal rules. When the government's projections are unrealistic, as they frequently are, the OBR says so publicly, creating a specific accountability mechanism that exists outside the direct political control of the government being evaluated. The OBR model has been meaningfully effective as an accountability mechanism. It has repeatedly and publicly identified instances where government fiscal claims were inconsistent with the economic evidence, creating political costs for fiscal dishonesty that previously did not exist. The specific moment when the OBR's independence proved most consequential, the Liz Truss mini-budget of 2022, whose unfunded tax cuts were assessed by markets as fiscally irresponsible in the absence of OBR verification, contributing to the gilt market crisis that ended the Truss government. But the fiscal council model has specific limits. An independent fiscal council can assess and publicize. It cannot compel. A government that chooses to ignore the OBR's assessment, implement its preferred fiscal policy, and accept the political consequences of doing so against independent advice is not legally prevented from doing this. The Fiscal Council is a reputational mechanism, not a constitutional one. Its effectiveness depends on the specific political environment in which it operates. In an environment where fiscal credibility matters to voters and to financial markets, the Council's assessments have bite. In an environment where the government believes its political support is immune to fiscal concerns, the Council's assessments can be publicly dismissed. Chapter 6. The Debt Tolerance Question. How much is actually too much? Here's the chapter that asks the specific question that underlies every discussion of government debt, but is rarely asked directly. How much government debt is actually too much? Where is the specific threshold beyond which debt becomes genuinely dangerous rather than merely inconvenient? And why is this question so much harder to answer than it should be? The question matters for the obvious reason. If there is a clear and identifiable limit to sustainable government debt, governments and citizens can use that limit as a specific policy target and stop worrying about debt levels below it. If there is no such limit, if debt sustainability depends on so many country-specific, time-specific, and context-specific factors that no general threshold can be identified, then the entire framework of debt limits and fiscal rules is built on shakier foundations than its proponents typically acknowledge. The Reinhardt-Rogoff controversy, when a single number drove global policy. Here's the specific intellectual episode that most clearly illustrates both the desire for a simple debt threshold and the specific dangers of treating a complex empirical question as if it had a simple numerical answer. The Reinhardt-Rogoff 90% threshold that briefly became the intellectual foundation for austerity policy across the developed world. In 2010, economists Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff published research suggesting that countries with government debt above 90% of GDP experienced meaningfully lower economic growth, approximately 1 percentage point per year less growth than countries with debt below this threshold. The implication appeared to be that 90% of GDP was the specific danger zone beyond which debt becomes a meaningful drag on economic performance. The political appeal of this specific number was extraordinary. Policymakers across Europe and in the United States who were advocating deficit reduction for both genuine economic reasons and the political convenience of having an intellectual justification for spending cuts, embraced the 90% threshold as the specific empirical target that justified fiscal austerity. The European Commission referenced it in policy documents. The IMF incorporated it into country assessments. Congressional testimony cited it directly. In 2013, a graduate student named Thomas Herndon discovered that the Reinhardt-Rogoff result depended in part on a spreadsheet error, a specific Excel coding mistake that excluded several high-debt, high-growth countries from the analysis. When the error was corrected and the methodology was questioned more broadly, the clean 90% threshold dissolved. Countries with debt above 90% did not uniformly experience growth slowdowns. The relationship between debt and growth was messier, more context-dependent, and less threshold-like than the original paper had implied. The specific lesson is not that Reinhardt and Rogoff were dishonest. They were not. But that the desire for a simple numerical answer to a complex empirical question is so strong, both intellectually and politically, that weak evidence of a threshold will be embraced and amplified well beyond what the underlying data can support. The real determinants of debt sustainability. Why context overwhelms thresholds. Here's the specific framework for thinking about debt sustainability that the failure of simple numerical thresholds suggests is actually more useful. The identification of the specific country characteristics that determine whether any given debt level is sustainable or dangerous. Currency denomination is the single most important determinant. A country that owes debt denominated in its own currency, a currency that its central bank creates, has a fundamentally different relationship with its debt than a country that owes debt denominated in a foreign currency. Japan carries a government debt to GDP ratio of approximately 260%, a number that would represent catastrophic fiscal overextension for virtually any other country, without experiencing the market panic or confidence collapse that the number would seem to imply, for the specific reason that Japan owes yen-denominated debt and the Bank of Japan creates yen. Greece, with debt at 120% of GDP, experienced an existential fiscal crisis because it owed euro-denominated debt and could not create euros. The maturity structure of the debt matters enormously for specific near-term vulnerability. A government with $1 trillion in debt that matures over the next 30 years, requiring only $33 billion per year in refinancing, faces very different rollover risk than a government with $1 trillion in debt that matures mostly over the next 2 years, requiring $500 billion per year in refinancing. The government with short maturity debt is acutely vulnerable to a confidence shock if investors become unwilling to roll over the maturing debt at any reasonable interest rate. The government faces an immediate liquidity crisis regardless of its long-run solvency. The creditor-based composition determines the stability of demand for the debt. Japan's government debt, as described in the previous video in this series, is held predominantly by Japanese domestic institutions and the Bank of Japan, creditors whose behavior is driven by domestic portfolio management needs, rather than global risk appetite fluctuations. A developing country whose debt is held predominantly by foreign investors and international capital. Markets is acutely vulnerable to global risk sentiment shifts that have nothing to do with its specific fiscal situation. The growth rate of the economy relative to the interest rate on the debt, the R-G relationship described in the previous video, determines whether a given primary deficit produces a stable, rising, or falling debt to GDP ratio over time. A country where G exceeds R can run modest primary deficits indefinitely without the debt ratio rising. A country where R exceeds G requires primary surpluses simply to stabilize the debt ratio, and primary deficits produce an accelerating debt spiral. Chapter 7. The Austerity Debate. The policy that promises everything and delivers ambiguity. Here's the chapter that examines the specific policy response to excessive government debt that dominated economic and political discourse in the decade following the 2008 financial crisis, austerity, and the specific evidence about whether it achieved what its proponents promised, at what cost, and what the episode tells us about the real-world constraints on debt reduction. Austerity is the specific policy of reducing government deficits through spending cuts and tax increases, tightening the fiscal position in order to stabilize or reduce the debt-to-GDP ratio. The intellectual case for austerity is straightforward. If debt is too large and growing, reduce the deficit that is making it grow. The political case is equally straightforward in environments where markets and credit rating agencies are demanding fiscal adjustment as the price of continued market access. The specific controversy: does austerity work? Does deficit reduction through spending cuts and tax increases achieve the goal of debt reduction, or does the economic contraction it produces reduce GDP, increase the deficit through lower tax revenues and higher automatic stabilization spending, and leave the debt-to-GDP ratio unchanged or higher than it would have been without the austerity? The multiplier debate. The economics that settled nothing. Here's the specific empirical dispute that was at the heart of the austerity controversy. The fiscal multiplier debate that determined whether deficit reduction was self-defeating or self-reinforcing. The fiscal multiplier is the specific number that captures the relationship between a change in government spending or taxation and the resulting change in GDP. A multiplier of 1 means that a $1 billion reduction in government spending reduces GDP by $1 billion. The direct loss of government expenditure is not offset by any private sector expansion. A multiplier of 0.5 means that a $1 billion spending cut reduces GDP by only $500 million. Private sector expansion partially offsets the fiscal contraction. A multiplier above 1 means that a $1 billion spending cut reduces GDP by more than $1 billion. The contraction is amplified through reduced private sector activity. The specific policy relevance. If the multiplier is high, above 1, austerity is potentially self-defeating because the GDP reduction it produces reduces tax revenues by more than the spending cut saves, potentially increasing the deficit and debt to GDP ratio rather than reducing them. If the multiplier is low, below 0.5, austerity is self-reinforcing because the GDP impact is modest and the deficit reduction is the dominant effect. The empirical evidence from the post-2008 austerity episode in Europe strongly suggested that multipliers were substantially higher than the standard models had assumed, that the spending cuts imposed on Greece, Portugal, Ireland, and Spain reduced GDP more severely than anticipated, producing the specific outcome where fiscal adjustment significantly worsened economic conditions without achieving the debt reduction that justified the economic pain. The IMF's own research, the specific 2012 paper by Olivier Blanchard and Daniel Lee that acknowledged the fund's multiplier estimates had been significantly too low, was a remarkable institutional admission that the analytical framework underlying austerity recommendations had been systematically wrong in its key empirical assumption. The Greek case study, austerity in its most extreme form. Here's the specific country experience that most starkly illustrates both the fiscal logic and the human consequences of austerity as a debt reduction strategy. Greece between 2010 and 2018. Greece in 2010 faced a genuine fiscal emergency. Its budget deficit was approximately 15% of GDP. Its debt was on an explosive upward trajectory. Market access had effectively closed. No investor would buy Greek government bonds at any interest rate that Greece could plausibly service. Without emergency external financing, Greece faced immediate default. The specific austerity program imposed as the condition for the European and IMF bailout financing was among the most severe fiscal adjustments ever implemented in a developed economy in peacetime. The Greek government reduced its primary deficit, the deficit before interest payments, by approximately 12 percentage points of GDP over 4 years. This required specific spending cuts to public sector wages, pensions, healthcare, education, and social services, combined with specific tax increases that fell hardest on formal sector workers who could not evade them. The specific economic consequences: Greek GDP fell by approximately 25% between 2008 and 2013, a depression, not a recession. Unemployment reached 27%, youth unemployment exceeded 50%. Emigration of working-age Greeks, particularly educated professionals, accelerated dramatically, reducing the specific human capital base that future Greek economic recovery would depend on. The poverty rate rose sharply. Suicide rates increased. The specific fiscal outcome, despite the most severe peacetime fiscal adjustment in modern European history, the Greek debt-to-GDP ratio increased rather than decreased over this period, because the GDP denominator collapsed faster than the nominal debt numerator declined. The austerity produced the human costs without achieving the primary fiscal goal, for the specific reason that multipliers were high, and the economic contraction amplified rather than resolved the debt problem. The honest assessment of the Greek experience is not that austerity was unnecessary. Greece's fiscal position was genuinely unsustainable and required adjustment, but that the specific design and pace of the adjustment imposed economic costs that far exceeded what informed analysis should have predicted, and that the fiscal outcome was considerably worse than the adjustment's architects projected. Chapter 8. The Modern Monetary Theory Challenge. Is the whole worry overblown? Here's the chapter that presents the specific intellectual challenge to the entire framework of government debt concern that has gained the most mainstream attention in recent years: modern monetary theory and the specific reasons that its most important insights are both genuinely important and genuinely misunderstood. Modern monetary theory, MMT, is simultaneously the most important heterodox challenge to mainstream fiscal thinking and the most frequently misrepresented economic framework in popular discourse. Its core insights deserve careful engagement rather than the dismissal or uncritical embrace that characterize most popular discussions of it. What MMT actually claims, the correct version. Here's the specific content of modern monetary theory's core claims, stated accurately rather than in the strawman versions that both its advocates and critics frequently deploy. MMT's central claim is specific and technically defensible: a government that issues debt in its own currency, the currency that its central bank creates, and cannot be forced into involuntary default on that debt, because it can always instruct its central bank to create the currency needed to service the debt. The U.S. government cannot be forced to default on dollar-denominated debt the way Greece was forced to default on euro-denominated debt, because the U.S. government can create dollars and Greece could not create euros. This specific claim is not controversial among mainstream economists. It is essentially correct, and the mainstream accepts it. The disagreement between MMT and mainstream economics is not about whether monetary sovereign governments can avoid default, but about what the binding constraint on their spending is. MMT's answer: the binding constraint on government spending is not the government's ability to finance the spending. It can always create the money, but the economy's productive capacity. When the government spends more than the economy's productive capacity can absorb, the result is inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods. And the relevant limit on government spending is the inflation it would produce, not the financing it would require. The specific policy implication that MMT advocates draw from this, and where the controversy begins, is that governments should spend up to the inflation limit rather than the revenue limit, using fiscal policy aggressively to maintain full employment and fund public services, and relying on tax policy primarily as an inflation control mechanism rather than a revenue-raising mechanism. YMMT's critics have a point. The inflation problem. Here's the specific limitation of MMT's policy prescriptions that mainstream economists most consistently identify: the specific difficulty of using inflation as the binding constraint that prevents excessive spending. The MMT framework relies on the government's ability to identify the inflation threshold and pull back spending before inflation becomes entrenched. This requires the specific combination of political will to reduce spending when inflation appears, the institutional capacity to accurately identify when the economy is at capacity and inflation is imminent, and the specific timing capability to adjust fiscal policy quickly enough to prevent inflation from becoming self-sustaining before it is controlled. Each of these requirements faces the specific political economy problems identified earlier in this video: the political will to reduce spending, to cut the programs whose creation generated political support, faces the spending ratchet problem. The institutional capacity to identify inflation threats early and accurately is limited by the specific uncertainty of macroeconomic forecasting. The timing requirement faces the specific lag between policy decisions and economic effects that makes fiscal policy a blunt and slow instrument for fine-tuning economic conditions. The specific historical evidence that should give MMT advocates pause. Every episode of sustained government, monetary financing, the specific policy of creating money to fund deficits, has eventually produced inflation, and in several cases, hyperinflation. The MMT response, that these episodes involved governments spending beyond productive capacity without adequate fiscal withdrawal, is theoretically coherent but empirically difficult to apply, because the productive capacity limit is not observable in real time with the precision that the framework requires. Chapter 9: The Debt That Democracy Built. What the pattern actually tells us. Here's the concluding chapter that steps back from the specific mechanisms described in the previous 8 chapters and asks the broader question that all of them together imply: what does the universal pattern of democratic government debt accumulation actually tell us about democracy as a system of government? The specific pattern is this: virtually every democratic government in the world has accumulated significant debt. The debt has accumulated across different political parties, different ideological orientations, different institutional arrangements, and different economic conditions. The debt accumulation is not the specific failure of any individual government or any individual political tradition. It is the systematic output of the democratic form of government applied to the specific economic and social conditions of the modern era. This pattern has two possible interpretations, and choosing between them matters enormously for how we think about fiscal policy. The pessimistic interpretation, democracy's fatal flaw. Here's the specific pessimistic interpretation of the democratic debt pattern. The argument that the universal accumulation of debt represents a fundamental flaw in democratic governance that cannot be corrected through better policy or better politicians. The argument stated directly, democratic governments consistently borrow because their incentive structure makes borrowing politically superior to taxing. The citizens who vote in democratic elections consistently prefer to receive services today and pay for them tomorrow, because today's benefits are certain and tomorrow's costs are distant. The politicians who seek election in democratic systems consistently offer what voters prefer: spending today, deferred payment tomorrow. The institutional constraints designed to prevent this, balanced budget rules, debt ceilings, fiscal councils, are consistently circumvented because they were designed by the same political systems whose incentives they are supposed to constrain. If this interpretation is correct, the debt accumulation pattern is not a bug in democratic systems that can be fixed with better rules. It is a feature of democratic systems that reflects the genuine preferences of democratic majorities for present consumption over future fiscal responsibility. The debt is democracy expressing itself. The optimistic interpretation, democracy's pragmatic adaptation. Here's the specific optimistic interpretation of the same pattern. The argument that democratic debt accumulation, while real and concerning in its long-run trajectory, represents not a fatal flaw, but a pragmatic adaptation to genuine economic and social needs. The argument, stated directly, most of the debt that democratic governments have accumulated was accumulated for specific legitimate reasons: wars whose outcomes justified the borrowing, recessions whose severity was reduced by fiscal stimulus, investments in infrastructure and human capital that generated genuine long-run returns, and social insurance systems that address specific market failures in the provision of retirement security and healthcare. The debt is not the product of pure fiscal irresponsibility. It is the product of governments responding to real demands from their citizens for services that markets would not provide in circumstances where borrowing was genuinely the appropriate financing approach. The specific evidence for this interpretation: the countries with the highest debt levels are not the most dysfunctional democracies. They are often among the most successful. Japan, with 260% debt to GDP, is a stable, prosperous, technologically sophisticated economy. The United States, with 120% debt to GDP, remains the world's largest economy and the issuer of its reserve currency. The debt has accumulated without producing the catastrophic consequences that the most alarmed fiscal hawks predicted, suggesting that the democratic political system's revealed preference for borrowing reflects a genuine assessment that the services financed are worth the cost. Chapter 10. The Inflation Tax, the debt reduction tool that governments never admit to using. Here's the chapter that addresses the specific mechanism through which governments have historically reduced their debt burdens most frequently, most effectively, and most quietly. The inflation tax that erodes the real value of outstanding debt without requiring a single vote in Parliament, a single explicit spending cut, or a single honest conversation with the electorate about the true cost of accumulated borrowing. The inflation tax is not a tax in the conventional sense. It does not appear in any budget document. No politician campaigns on it. No legislation authorizes it. It is the specific, silent transfer of wealth from the holders of fixed nominal claims, the people who are owed money in fixed dollar amounts, to the issuers of those claims, the governments and debtors, whose obligations shrink in real terms as prices rise. It is the most politically convenient debt reduction mechanism ever devised, which is precisely why it has been used so consistently throughout history, and why understanding it is essential to understanding how the debt story actually ends. The mechanics of inflation as a debt reduction tool. Here's the specific arithmetic through which inflation reduces the real burden of government debt, stated precisely enough that the mechanism is clear and the scale is comprehensible. Government debt is almost universally denominated in nominal terms. The United States government's promise to pay $1,000 at the maturity of a treasury bond is a promise to pay $1,000, not $1,000 adjusted for inflation, not $1,000 worth of goods and services at current prices, but the specific number 1,000, regardless of what that number buys at the time of repayment. When inflation occurs between the issuance of the bond and its maturity, the real value of the government's repayment obligation declines. A $1,000 bond issued when inflation was expected to be zero, but experiencing 10% annual inflation over 10 years will be repaid with dollars that are worth approximately 61% of their original purchasing power. The government repays the nominal $1,000, but that $1,000 buys only what $610 bought when the bond was issued. The real burden of the debt has declined by 39% without any nominal default, any debt restructuring negotiation, or any explicit acknowledgement that the creditor has received less than they were promised in economically meaningful terms. At the level of national debt, the arithmetic is correspondingly large. The United States experienced significant inflation during the 1970s. The consumer price index roughly tripled between 1970 and 1983. The real value of fixed-rate treasury bonds issued before this inflation episode declined substantially over this period. Creditors who held long-dated treasuries issued at the low yields of the 1960s received their nominal principal back, but with dollars whose purchasing power had been dramatically reduced. The government's real debt burden fell correspondingly, not through fiscal discipline, not through surpluses, but through the specific mechanism of inflation reducing the real value of nominal obligations. Why governments never admit this is what they're doing. Here's the specific political economy of inflation as a debt reduction tool. The reason that governments consistently use it without ever acknowledging that using it is precisely what they are doing. The specific political advantage of inflation over explicit default or explicit tax increases is its diffuseness. When a government defaults, there are identifiable victims, the specific bondholders who receive less than they were promised. These victims know they have been harmed, they know who harmed them, and they respond politically and legally. When a government raises taxes, there are identifiable victims, the specific taxpayers whose after-tax income declines. These victims vote against the government that raised their taxes. When a government inflates, the victims are diffuse and the causation is difficult to attribute. Every holder of cash, every recipient of a fixed nominal payment, every saver with a bank account earning less than the inflation rate is made worse off by inflation. But the specific loss is invisible in daily life, accumulates gradually rather than arriving suddenly, and is easily attributed to external forces, oil prices, supply chain disruptions, pandemic effects, rather than to the specific fiscal and monetary decisions that ultimately produce it. The specific political narrative that accompanies every inflationary episode illustrates this attribution problem perfectly. No government in the post-war era has ever announced, "We have accumulated too much debt, and we intend to reduce its real value through inflation at the expense of our creditors and savers." Every inflationary episode has instead been explained as the result of external shocks, the oil embargo, the pandemic, the supply chain disruption, the war in Ukraine, whose role in initiating the inflation is real, but whose role in sustaining it is consistently overstated relative to the role of fiscal and monetary accommodation. The 2021 to 2023 inflation episode, the debt reduction nobody discussed. Here's the specific recent episode that most clearly illustrates inflation's role as a debt reduction mechanism operating in real time. The inflation surge of 2021 to 2023 and its specific impact on the real value of the extraordinary debt accumulation of the COVID period. During 2020 and 2021, the United States government borrowed approximately $6 trillion to finance the COVID relief programs, the stimulus checks, the enhanced unemployment benefits, the Paycheck Protection Program loans, the direct health care spending. This borrowing was financed by issuing treasury bonds at the historically low interest rates prevailing at the time. Many bonds were issued at rates between 0.5% and 2%. The inflation that followed, reaching a peak of approximately 9% annually in mid-2022, reduced the real value of these nominally fixed, obligations by approximately 15% to 20% over the subsequent 2 years. The specific holders of the low-yield pandemic-era treasuries, pension funds, foreign central banks, domestic institutional investors, experienced significant real losses on these holdings as inflation eroded their purchasing power without any nominal default. Simultaneously, the U.S. economy's nominal GDP grew rapidly during this inflationary period. Because nominal GDP grows when prices rise, even if real output is unchanged. The debt-to-GDP ratio declined not because debt shrank, but because the denominator, nominal GDP, grew faster than the numerator, the nominally fixed debt stock. The United States debt-to-GDP ratio fell from approximately 135% in 2020 to approximately 120% in 2023, without a single dollar of debt being explicitly repaid through the specific mechanism of inflation growing the GDP denominator. This is the inflation tax operating exactly as historical precedent suggests it operates, reducing the real debt burden silently, diffusely, and at the expense of creditors who lent money expecting one level of purchasing power and received another. The limits of the inflation solution. When the cure becomes the disease. Here's the specific constraint that prevents inflation from being an unlimited debt reduction tool, the specific threshold beyond which the inflation that reduces the debt burden also destroys the institutional credibility that makes future borrowing possible. Moderate, unexpected inflation, the specific combination of rates that are meaningfully above expectations but below the level that disrupts economic calculation, is the efficient debt reduction tool. It reduces the real debt burden without triggering the specific behavioral responses that make high inflation economically destructive. High or hyperinflationary episodes are categorically different. When inflation reaches the level at which economic actors begin pricing it into their behavior, demanding inflation-indexed wages, refusing to hold cash, insisting on short-term or inflation-linked contracts, the specific mechanisms that make moderate inflation a useful debt reduction tool break down. Lenders refuse to issue long-term, fixed-rate bonds, denying the government the specific instrument through which inflation erodes debt. Workers demand wage increases that match or exceed inflation, reducing the real resource transfer to the government. Businesses price in future inflation, accelerating the inflation through price-setting behavior. The inflation becomes self-sustaining and increasingly severe, ultimately destroying the monetary system's ability to perform its basic functions. The specific historical examples of where the inflation tax crossed this threshold, Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Argentina, demonstrate that the tool has a specific upper limit beyond which its application destroys the institutional framework it was supposed to serve. The art of using inflation as a debt reduction mechanism is keeping it below the threshold that triggers the behavioral responses that make it self-defeating, a specific calibration challenge that has proven consistently difficult to achieve in practice. Chapter 11. The Generational Theft Debate. Who actually pays for government debt? Here's the chapter that addresses the specific moral and economic question that underlies every political debate about government debt, the question of intergenerational fairness, of whether current governments borrowing against future revenue are making a legitimate investment in the future, or committing a specific act of fiscal theft against people who have no vote in today's elections. The generational theft framing is the specific moral argument that has animated fiscal conservatism across the political spectrum, the argument that every dollar of debt accumulated today is a dollar that future taxpayers must service, that borrowing to finance current consumption is a specific transfer from future generations to the present, and that a democratic system that makes this transfer consistently is morally deficient regardless of whether it is technically sustainable. The counterargument is equally specific. The future generations who will service the debt are also the beneficiaries of the spending it financed. The child who will pay taxes to service the debt that built the school she attended, the road she drives on, and the research that produced the technology she uses is not obviously a victim of intergenerational theft. She is the specific beneficiary of an intergenerational investment whose cost she is paying for alongside its benefits. The burden of debt. Two contradictory economic views. Here's the specific economic disagreement about whether government debt actually burdens future generations. a disagreement that has persisted among economists for decades and that reflects genuine uncertainty about a technically difficult question. The conventional view, the one that underlies the generational theft argument, holds that government debt burdens future generations by requiring them to pay higher taxes to service the debt, taxes that reduce their disposable income and constrain their choices. The specific mechanism, future taxpayers pay interest to current bondholders, transferring purchasing power from future workers to current retirees and investors who hold the bonds. The debt is a claim on future production that current generations have sold to finance current consumption. The Ricardian equivalence view, associated with economist Robert Barrow and representing the most sophisticated challenge to the conventional view, argues that government debt does not burden future generations in the aggregate because the current generation, anticipating the future tax burden the debt creates, saves more today to leave larger bequests to their children. The debt is offset by private saving, and future generations inherit both the tax liability and the private wealth their parents accumulated in anticipation of it. The net burden is zero. The honest assessment of Ricardian equivalence is that it describes a theoretically coherent mechanism whose empirical relevance is considerably more limited than its theoretical elegance might suggest. Most people do not consciously adjust their saving behavior in response to government borrowing decisions. Households with no wealth to bequeath cannot increase their bequests in response to government debt. The altruistic links between generations that Ricardian equivalence assumes, parents who care about their children's welfare enough to fully offset government debt through private saving, are real but incomplete. The theory identifies a genuine offsetting force without eliminating the net burden. The asset side. What future generations inherit along with the debt. Here's the specific correction to the generational theft framing that the most honest analysis of intergenerational fiscal transfers requires: the recognition that future generations inherit not just the debt but also the assets, institutions, and productive capacity that the debt finance spending created. A generation that borrows to build a highway system, a university network, a research infrastructure, and a public health system is not simply extracting resources from the future. It is creating specific productive assets whose returns will benefit future generations. The future generation that services the highway debt also uses the highway, reducing its transportation costs. The future taxpayer who services the university debt also benefits from the innovation and human capital that the universities produced. The intergenerational transfer is not simply a theft. It has a specific quid pro quo in the form of the productive capacity that the debt-financed investment created. This is the specific reason that the generational theft framing is most compelling when applied to debt accumulated to finance current consumption, the pension benefits, the healthcare costs, the public sector wages of the current generation, and least compelling when applied to debt accumulated to finance genuine investment. The debt that financed the interstate highway system was not a theft from future Americans. It was an investment whose returns they are still collecting. The debt accumulated to finance a specific generation's retirement health care at a level that generation was unwilling to fund through its own taxes is closer to the generational theft framing, a specific extraction of future resources to finance present consumption with no corresponding asset created. The demographic verdict. When the arithmetic becomes inescapable. Here's the specific point at which the abstract debate about generational fairness becomes a concrete arithmetic problem. The specific demographic transition that converts the theoretical discussion of intergenerational burden into the practical question of who specifically will pay for the retirement and healthcare of the largest generation in history. The baby boom generation, approximately 76 million Americans born between 1946 and 1964, with equivalent large cohorts in most developed economies, is now in or approaching retirement. This generation's retirement creates a specific fiscal arithmetic problem that is not a matter of political philosophy, but of simple mathematics. The pay-as-you-go pension and healthcare systems that most developed economies operate require the working generation to finance the retired generation's benefits through their current taxes and contributions. When the ratio of workers to retirees was 5-1, the ratio that prevailed when these systems were designed, each worker's contribution to supporting retirees was modest. At a 2-1 ratio, the ratio toward which demographics are moving, each worker must contribute more than twice as much to maintain the same per-retiree benefit level. The specific options are arithmetic rather than political. Reduce per-retiree benefits, increase the working population's tax burden, raise the retirement age to reduce the retiree population and expand the worker population, increase immigration to expand the working age base, or borrow, deferring the arithmetic problem to a future period when it will be both more acute and more difficult to address. Every developed economy has chosen some combination of these options, with the specific mix reflecting its particular political economy. Most have borrowed substantially, deferring the arithmetic reckoning while making it larger through the accumulation of interest costs. The generation that will ultimately face the full arithmetic of paying for the baby boomers' retirement is the specific generation that had no vote when the spending commitments were made, the specific population that the generational theft argument identifies as the victim of current fiscal irresponsibility. Chapter 12. The Debt of the Developing World. Why the same rules don't apply. Here's the chapter that addresses the specific dimension of the government debt question that is most consequential in human terms and least represented in mainstream fiscal discourse. The debt situation of the world's lower-income economies, where the specific combination of foreign currency obligations, commodity-dependent revenues, institutional fragility, and limited market access creates a fiscal environment that is categorically more dangerous than anything the developed world typically experiences. The developing world debt problem is not a scaled-down version of the developed world debt problem. It is a qualitatively different problem, driven by different mechanisms, producing different consequences and requiring different solutions. Understanding the specific differences is essential to understanding why the same debt-to-GDP ratio that is manageable in the United States is catastrophic in Zambia, why the same interest rate increase that is inconvenient in Germany is existential in Sri Lanka, and why the same fiscal policy advice that is appropriate in France is actively harmful when applied without modification to Ethiopia. The original sin problem. Why developing countries cannot borrow in their own currency. Here's the specific structural disadvantage that most developing economies face in their borrowing, the original sin of being unable to issue international debt in their own currency, a constraint that creates a permanent and specifically dangerous vulnerability that no amount of good fiscal management can fully eliminate. The term original sin, coined by economists Barry Eichengreen and Ricardo Hausmann, describes the specific situation of economies that can only borrow internationally in foreign currencies, typically US dollars or euros. The sin is original in the sense that it is not the result of any specific policy failure by the borrowing country. It is the structural outcome of the specific characteristics of global capital markets, in which investors will only lend in currencies whose value they can predict and whose legal enforceability they trust. The specific mechanism of the original sin vulnerability, a developing country government that borrows in dollars, has revenues in its local currency, the taxes it collects from its domestic economy. To service its dollar debt, it must convert local currency into dollars at the prevailing exchange rate. When the local currency depreciates, as it does during precisely the economic downturns when the government most needs fiscal flexibility, the dollar debt service costs increase in local currency terms. The government must spend more of its depreciating local currency to acquire the dollars needed to service the debt just when its local currency revenues are declining and its social expenditure needs are increasing. This specific combination, rising debt service costs in local currency, declining revenues, increasing social needs, all occurring simultaneously during a period of currency depreciation, is the specific mechanism that converts a manageable debt level into an acute fiscal crisis in developing economies. Countries that would be perfectly solvent at stable exchange rates become insolvent when their currencies depreciate through no change in their domestic fiscal position. The commodity curse, the revenue that disappears when you need it most. Here's the specific fiscal challenge faced by the large number of developing economies whose government revenue is predominantly derived from commodity exports: oil, copper, cocoa, coffee, minerals, the revenues that are simultaneously the source of fiscal capacity and the source of fiscal volatility. Commodity-dependent economies face a specific fiscal structure in which government revenue is closely tied to commodity prices that they do not control and cannot predict. When oil prices are high, an oil-exporting government collects substantial revenue, royalties, profit taxes, state enterprise dividends that allows it to finance public services, invest in infrastructure, and service its debt comfortably. When oil prices fall, as they do regularly and dramatically, the same government's revenue collapses simultaneously with the fall in prices, creating an immediate fiscal gap that must be bridged either through expenditure cuts or through borrowing, the specific cruel irony of commodity dependence. Commodity prices tend to fall during global economic downturns, precisely the periods when the developing country's population most needs government support, when private sector employment is declining, and when the social pressures on government spending are greatest. The fiscal capacity to respond to the crisis disappears at the moment when the need for fiscal response is highest. The specific borrowing dynamic this creates, commodity-dependent governments borrow heavily during commodity price booms, when market access is easy and yields are low, financing infrastructure and social spending that their high commodity revenues appear to support. When commodity prices fall, the revenues disappear. The debt service remains, the market access tightens, and the government faces the specific combination of reduced revenue, unchanged debt obligations, and deteriorating market conditions that produces the debt crises that have recurred throughout the developing world for decades, the institutional capacity gap, when the government cannot collect what it is owed. Here's the specific dimension of the developing world fiscal challenge that receives the least attention in mainstream economic analysis and the institutional capacity problem that prevents many developing country governments from collecting adequate revenue even when their economies generate sufficient activity to support adequate public services. Tax administration, the specific institutional function of identifying taxable activity, assessing the tax owed, collecting the payment, and enforcing compliance, requires a level of institutional sophistication, data infrastructure, and rule of law reliability that many developing economies have not yet developed. The consequences are specific and severe. Tax to GDP ratios in low-income countries average approximately 15% compared to approximately 35% in developed economies, a gap that reflects not merely the lower income levels of developing economies, but the specific institutional incapacity to capture the taxable activity that does exist. The specific mechanisms of this institutional capacity gap are multiple. Tax authorities lack the data systems to identify informal economic activity. Property taxation, among the most efficient forms of taxation and the one most difficult to avoid, requires reliable property registries, functioning courts, and enforcement capacity that many developing country governments lack. Value-added tax administration requires business registration systems, invoicing requirements, and audit capacity that are technically demanding to implement. Income tax collection from informal sector workers, the majority of the workforce in many developing economies, is practically impossible without the wage withholding infrastructure that formal employment relationships provide. The result is a specific fiscal trap. The government cannot adequately finance public services because it cannot collect adequate revenue. The inadequate public services, poor education, poor health, unreliable infrastructure, reduce the productive capacity of the economy and the formal sector employment that would expand the tax base. The reduced tax base further constrains fiscal capacity. The cycle continues. Chapter 13. The Future of Fiscal Policy, Technology, Climate, and the Spending Pressures. Nobody is budgeting for. Here's the chapter that looks forward from the specific historical and structural analysis of the previous 12 chapters to identify the specific new pressures that will shape government fiscal positions over the coming decades, pressures that are sufficiently large and sufficiently certain in their direction that any serious analysis of why governments are in debt must incorporate them into its framework. The future fiscal pressures identified in this chapter are not speculative. They are the specific, visible, quantifiable consequences of trends that are already underway. The energy transition required to address climate change, the fiscal implications of artificial intelligence and automation, the healthcare cost implications of new medical technologies, and the defense spending implications of a more geopolitically contested world. Each of these trends creates specific expenditure pressures that governments have not adequately incorporated into their fiscal planning. The climate transition bill, the expenditure that cannot be deferred indefinitely. Here's the specific fiscal consequence of climate change and the energy transition that is the largest unbudgeted expenditure commitment in the fiscal plans of most developed economies. the investment required to decarbonize energy systems, adapt infrastructure to climate impacts, and manage the transition away from fossil fuel dependence. The International Energy Agency estimates that achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050 requires approximately $4 trillion per year in clean energy investment globally, roughly 3 times the current level of clean energy investment. The World Bank estimates that developing countries alone will require approximately $2.4 trillion per year in climate-related investment by 2030. These are not speculative numbers derived from extreme climate scenarios. They are the specific investment requirements of the mainstream net zero pathways that most developed country governments have formally committed to through the Paris Agreement and subsequent pledges. The specific fiscal challenge: a substantial portion of this investment, the public infrastructure, the regulatory systems, the adaptation measures, the support for vulnerable communities and industries, must come from government budgets. Private investment will finance a significant share of the clean energy transition, driven by policy mechanisms like carbon pricing and clean energy subsidies. But the adaptation to climate impacts, the coastal defenses, the flood infrastructure, the drought-resistant agricultural systems, the cooling systems for increasingly hot urban environments, is predominantly a public responsibility that markets will not voluntarily finance. The specific political economy problem: climate investment requires spending today to prevent costs tomorrow. Precisely the temporal structure that democratic political systems handle least well. The costs of building a seawall are immediate and visible. The costs of not building a seawall, the future flood damage, are distant, probabilistic, and easy to dismiss as someone else's problem in someone else's term of office. The specific result is the systematic underinvestment in climate adaptation that characterizes virtually every democratic government's actual infrastructure spending relative to what climate science says is necessary. The artificial intelligence disruption, the fiscal consequences of technological unemployment. Here's the specific fiscal implication of artificial intelligence and automation that receives the least adequate treatment in mainstream economic and fiscal analysis. The potential revenue and expenditure consequences of a technological transition that could simultaneously reduce the tax base and increase the social expenditure demands on government budgets. The specific fiscal risk of AI-driven automation is not the science fiction scenario of mass unemployment. It is the more specific and more likely scenario of significant labor market disruption concentrated in specific occupational categories with transition costs that fall disproportionately on specific groups of workers who lack the specific skills to move into the occupations that AI cannot automate. The tax base implications are specific. Income tax revenues, the largest revenue source for most developed economies, depend on employment and wages. If AI automation reduces employment in middle-skill occupations, the administrative, clerical, data processing, and routine cognitive tasks that represent a large share of formal sector employment, the income tax base shrinks. If automation increases corporate profits while reducing labor's share of income, the key specific distributional consequence that preliminary evidence from previous automation waves suggests: the tax system's heavy reliance on labor income rather than capital income becomes a specific structural revenue vulnerability. The expenditure implications are equally specific. Workers displaced by automation require retraining, a genuine public investment that existing labor market programs are not designed or funded to provide at scale. The transition period between displacement and reemployment requires income support, unemployment benefits, retraining grants, relocation assistance, that existing social insurance systems were designed for shorter duration unemployment spells than AI displacement may produce. The geographic concentration of automation impacts, in specific industries and specific communities, creates specific local fiscal crises in the jurisdictions most affected. The defense spending return, the geopolitical tax on fiscal sustainability. Here's the specific external pressure on government fiscal positions that has returned most dramatically in the 2020s after a long post-Cold War holiday: the defense spending requirements of a more geopolitically contested world, and the specific fiscal consequences of abandoning the post-Cold War peace dividend that allowed most developed economies to reduce their defense budgets through the 1990s and 2000s. The peace dividend, the specific reduction in defense spending that followed the end of the Cold War, contributed meaningfully to the fiscal improvement that many developed economies experienced through the 1990s. The United States reduced defense spending from approximately 6% of GDP in the late Cold War period to approximately 3% in the early 2000s. NATO members reduced defense spending even more dramatically, with most falling well below the formal 2% of GDP commitment. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the broader geopolitical contest between the United States and China have reversed this trend with specific speed. NATO members are committing to 2% defense spending targets, or beyond, in the case of Poland and the Baltic states, that represent specific percentage point increases over current spending levels. The United States is maintaining defense spending at levels that reflect its specific global commitments. Japan, historically constrained to 1% of GDP in defense spending by its post-World War II constitution, is moving toward 2% with specific urgency following developments in its regional security environment. The specific fiscal arithmetic: each percentage point of GDP devoted to defense spending is a percentage point not available for deficit reduction. For European NATO members that had allowed defense spending to fall to 1% to 1.5% of GDP, committing to 2% spending represents a specific structural increase in government expenditure that must be financed from some combination of increased taxes, reduced other spending, or increased borrowing. In the specific political environment of most European democracies, where tax increases are electorally painful and spending cuts face organized opposition, the most likely financing mechanism is borrowing. The medical technology revolution. The healthcare cost spiral accelerates. Here's the specific healthcare spending pressure that will dwarf all previous healthcare cost growth: the coming wave of genuinely revolutionary medical technologies whose capabilities will be extraordinary and whose costs will be extraordinary in proportion. The specific medical technologies that are advancing most rapidly: cell and gene therapies, precision oncology treatments, Alzheimer's disease interventions, obesity medications, share a common characteristic: they are extraordinarily effective at extending life and reducing suffering, and they are extraordinarily expensive to develop and administer. A single course of gene therapy for a genetic disease can cost $2 million to $3 million. The new class of GLP-1 obesity medications costs approximately $12,000 to $15,000 per year per patient. The Alzheimer's treatments recently approved represent a specific new category of long-term, high-cost intervention for a disease that affects approximately 6 million Americans. The fiscal arithmetic of these technologies is specific and alarming. If effective Alzheimer's treatment reduces the disease's prevalence and severity, it reduces the enormous caregiving and long-term care costs that Alzheimer's currently generates, a specific offset to the treatment cost that makes the net fiscal impact uncertain. But the treatment cost is immediate and specific. The cost offset is probabilistic and long-term. Government healthcare budgets will be required to finance the treatment cost in the short term before the cost offsets materialize, adding a specific new category of front-loaded expenditure to already strained healthcare budgets. Chapter 14. The Political Solutions. What governments have tried and why it rarely works. Here's the chapter that assembles the specific reform attempts, the policy innovations, institutional redesigns, and political strategies that governments have deployed to address their debt accumulation, and assesses honestly why these attempts have achieved less than their proponents promised. This is not a chapter about failure for its own sake. It is the specific analytical exercise of understanding why fiscally intelligent policies that work well in economic models consistently disappoint when implemented through democratic political systems, and what this pattern of disappointment tells us about the realistic range of achievable fiscal improvement. The privatization wave, the one-time revenue that solved nothing. Here's the specific fiscal strategy that swept through developed and developing economies from the 1980s through the 2000s, the privatization of state-owned enterprises, and the honest assessment of what it achieved fiscally, which is less than its fiscal proponents claimed and more than its critics acknowledged. The fiscal logic of privatization was specific. Governments owned valuable enterprises, telecoms, airlines, utilities, oil companies, banks, whose value could be monetized by selling them to private investors. The proceeds could be used to reduce government debt, eliminating both the asset and the corresponding debt and improving the government's balance sheet. The ongoing fiscal burden of subsidizing inefficient state enterprises would be eliminated. The private owners, motivated by profit, would run the enterprises more efficiently, generating higher tax revenues from profitable operations than the loss-making state enterprises had. The specific fiscal reality was more complicated. The privatization proceeds were genuinely large. The UK privatization program of the 1980s raised approximately £65 billion in today's terms, but the proceeds were frequently used not to reduce debt, but to finance current expenditure. The specific one-time revenue was spent, leaving the government with neither the asset nor the debt reduction that would have improved its long-run fiscal position. Selling an asset to finance consumption is the specific financial equivalent of selling your house to pay for a holiday. It improves the immediate cash position without improving the underlying financial trajectory. The tax reform cycles, the revenue that never materialized. Here's the specific pattern in tax reform that most clearly illustrates the gap between fiscal reform rhetoric and fiscal reform reality. The consistent promise that tax reform will generate economic growth sufficient to pay for tax cuts, and the specific evidence that this promise has not been delivered in the cases where it has been most confidently made. Supply-side tax reform. The specific approach of reducing marginal tax rates on income and capital with the expectation that the resulting economic expansion will generate sufficient new taxable activity to offset or exceed the revenue loss from the rate reduction has been implemented in various forms in the United States, the United Kingdom, and other developed economies since the early 1980s. The specific empirical record, the Reagan tax cuts of 1981, were accompanied by predictions that the resulting economic growth would generate sufficient revenue to prevent any increase in the deficit. The deficit increased dramatically, reaching levels that required the specific tax increases of 1982, 1983, and subsequent years to partially address. The Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 were similarly accompanied by projections of revenue neutral or revenue positive economic effects that did not materialize. The Trump tax cuts of 2017, whose proponents similarly projected self-financing economic effects, produced a specific increase in the deficit rather than the projected revenue recovery. This is not a partisan observation. It is the specific empirical pattern that emerges from examining the revenue consequences of major tax rate reductions in developed economies over the past 40 years. Marginal tax rate reductions have genuine economic effects. They do not, at the specific rate levels that have prevailed in developed economies since the 1980s, produce economic expansions large enough to fully offset the direct revenue loss from the rate reduction. The pension reform attempts, the politically impossible becomes occasionally possible. Here's the specific reform area where the combination of demographic pressure, fiscal arithmetic, and long implementation horizons has produced the most meaningful, genuine fiscal adjustment, pension reform, and the specific political conditions that have made this adjustment occasionally achievable despite its difficulty. Pension reform is fiscally essential in most developed economies, and politically agonizing in all of them. Raising the retirement age, the single most effective reform for reducing the fiscal burden of aging populations, directly reduces the benefits of a large, politically organized, and highly mobilized constituency. People approaching retirement age who have planned their lives around the specific retirement date that the reform threatens to change. The specific pension reforms that have succeeded share common characteristics. They have been implemented with long transition periods, changes that apply to people retiring in 20 or 30 years, not to people retiring next year, which reduces the mobilization of opposition by separating the timing of the reform from the timing of its effects. They have been implemented during periods of acute fiscal crisis, the specific moments when the alternative to reform was sufficiently frightening that the organized opposition to pension cuts accepted changes it would have blocked in normal circumstances. Greece's pension cuts during the 2010 to 2018 adjustment period, France's pension reforms in 2023, Sweden's comprehensive pension reform of the 1990s, each was achieved under the specific conditions of either acute crisis or sustained political will that normal democratic politics rarely sustains. Chapter 15. The debt that cannot be spoken, the political silence around fiscal truth. Here's the final analytical chapter before the conclusion, the chapter that addresses the specific phenomenon at the heart of the democratic debt problem that all the previous chapters have circled but not directly named, the systematic political silence around fiscal truth that prevents democratic electorates from making genuinely informed decisions about the fiscal choices their governments are making on their behalf. The silence is not accidental. It is the specific, rational response of political actors to the specific incentive structure described in Chapter 2. The structure that rewards those who deliver visible benefits today and punishes those who impose visible costs today, regardless of the long-run consequences of either. The silence is maintained through specific mechanisms, the optimistic economic assumptions embedded in official forecasts, the accounting conventions that exclude specific categories of obligation from the headline debt number, the political language that frames debt finance spending as investment and debt reduction as austerity, and the specific institutional design of budget processes that makes long-run fiscal consequences invisible in annual budget debates. The rosy scenario problem. Why official forecasts are systematically too optimistic. Here's the specific mechanism through which governments consistently present their fiscal trajectories in more favorable terms than the evidence supports. The systematic optimism bias in official economic and fiscal projections that has been documented across virtually every developed economy. The specific evidence is striking. A systematic review of official fiscal projections across developed economies found that governments consistently overestimate GDP growth, underestimate future spending growth, and overestimate future revenue growth, producing projections that show deficit reduction materializing in future years that then fail to arrive as projected. The deficit that is projected to shrink to 1% of GDP in 3 years is still 3% of GDP in 3 years because the growth projection that underlay the deficit reduction path did not materialize. This systematic optimism is not primarily the result of dishonesty, though incentives for dishonesty exist. It is primarily the result of the specific political economy of budget forecasting, in which the official forecasters operate within institutions whose political leadership has strong preferences for projections that show fiscal improvement. The Treasury official who projects a larger deficit than the politically convenient number faces specific internal pressure. The independent fiscal institution, the OBR, the CBO, the IMF, faces less internal pressure, but still operates in a political environment where consistently pessimistic projections generate specific political blowback. The language of fiscal obfuscation, how governments talk about debt without talking about debt. Here's the specific linguistic apparatus through which political discourse about government debt is systematically obscured, the particular vocabulary of fiscal policy that allows governments to accumulate debt while describing themselves as fiscally responsible. Investment is the specific word that does the most fiscal obfuscation work in contemporary political language. Every government expenditure, regardless of whether it produces genuine long-run returns, can be described as an investment in our future, and once it is described as an investment, the normal scrutiny applied to expenditure is partially suspended, because investments are, by definition, justified by future returns, whose magnitude is uncertain and whose realization is deferred. The specific effect of the investment framing is to make current expenditure appear self-financing in a vague, future-oriented way that exempts it from the immediate question of how it will be paid for. Fiscal responsibility is the specific phrase that allows governments to signal virtue without accepting the specific constraints that genuine fiscal responsibility would require. A government that announces it is committed to fiscal responsibility while running a 5% of GDP deficit is using the phrase as a substitute for the specific policy actions, spending cuts, tax increases, reform of entitlement programs that fiscal responsibility would actually entail. The phrase is performative rather than descriptive. Investing in growth is the specific framing that converts deficit spending from a fiscal weakness into a fiscal strength. The argument that the borrowed money will generate sufficient economic growth to pay for itself and more. This argument is sometimes correct. Genuine public investment in high-return infrastructure does generate growth that expands the tax base, and is more frequently invoked than the evidence supports, applied to spending categories where the growth-generating mechanism is unclear or where the returns are insufficient to justify the borrowing cost. The informed electorate problem, democracy's prerequisite that is never fully met. Here's the specific foundational challenge that underlies every mechanism of fiscal obfuscation and every failure of fiscal rules, the specific requirement of democratic theory that voters be sufficiently informed about the choices their governments are making to hold those governments accountable, and the specific ways in which the complexity of fiscal policy consistently defeats this requirement. Democratic accountability for fiscal decisions requires that voters understand what their government is spending, why it is spending it, what it costs, and who ultimately pays. The specific reality is that fiscal policy is sufficiently complex that even engaged, educated citizens struggle to understand the specific implications of fiscal choices. The difference between the deficit and the debt, the specific mechanism through which pension unfunded liabilities affect fiscal sustainability, the specific consequences of different debt trajectories for future tax burdens and service levels. The complexity is not accidental. Fiscal policy is genuinely complex, and the complexity resists simplification without distortion. But the complexity is also, in a specific sense, convenient. A system that is difficult to understand is difficult to hold accountable, and governments that benefit from the specific opacity of their fiscal choices have limited incentives to invest in the specific public education that would enable genuine democratic accountability. The specific consequence: democratic electorates consistently vote for fiscal outcomes that careful surveys suggest they would not choose if they fully understood the trade-offs involved. Voters who are asked whether they want higher spending on specific programs consistently say yes. Voters who are asked whether they want higher taxes to finance those programs consistently say no. Voters who are asked whether they are comfortable with the deficits that result from wanting more spending and less taxation consistently say no. The specific contradiction at the heart of democratic fiscal preferences, wanting the government to spend more, tax less, and borrow less simultaneously, is not the result of voter irrationality, but of the specific difficulty of understanding the binding nature of fiscal constraints when they are never clearly communicated. Conclusion: the honest reckoning. Here's the conclusion that the 15 chapters of this video have been building toward: the specific, honest, complete summary of why governments are in debt, what it means, and what, realistically, is going to happen next. You came to this video with a question that sounds political, but turns out to be economic, psychological, institutional, and ultimately philosophical. Why are virtually every government in the world in debt? The complete answer, assembled from everything the previous chapters established, is this: governments are in debt because democratic political systems create specific incentives for deficit spending that are rational from the perspective of individual politicians, collectively damaging from the perspective of long-run fiscal sustainability, and essentially impossible to eliminate through better rules or better people because they are embedded in the specific structure of democratic decision-making itself. Governments are in debt because the specific structural forces in modern economies, the Baumol cost disease, demographic aging, healthcare cost inflation, the interest rate trap, create expenditure pressures that grow faster than the revenues available to finance them, regardless of the quality of the political decisions that govern the fiscal response to these pressures. Governments are in debt because the specific international environment of the modern global economy, the tax competition that has reduced corporate and capital tax revenues, the original sin that constrains developing country borrowing, the geopolitical pressures that require defense spending, creates revenue constraints and expenditure requirements that limit the fiscal space available for deficit reduction. Governments are in debt because the specific moral and economic logic of intergenerational investment genuinely justifies some debt accumulation, the debt that financed the infrastructure, the education, and the research whose returns are still flowing to current and future generations represents a real investment whose financing through borrowing was economically appropriate even if its accumulation has reached levels that create genuine sustainability questions. And governments are in debt because the specific political silence around fiscal truth, the optimistic forecasts, the obfuscating language, the accounting conventions that exclude inconvenient obligations, prevents democratic electorates from making genuinely informed choices about the fiscal trade-offs their governments are making on their behalf. None of these reasons is individually sufficient to explain the full pattern. All of them together are more than sufficient. They create a specific convergence of political, structural, institutional, and informational forces that makes debt accumulation the default outcome of democratic governance in modern economies. The specific question of what happens next has the same answer it has always had throughout the history of government debt. The debt resolves. It always resolves. The specific mechanism of resolution, whether growth, whether inflation, whether restructuring, whether genuine fiscal adjustment, whether some combination of all of these, is the question whose answer will differ across countries, across time, and across the specific political choices that democratic societies make in the years ahead. What the evidence of this video makes clear is that the resolution will not arrive through the specific mechanisms that political rhetoric typically promises, the fiscal responsibility that politicians announce and consistently fail to deliver, the growth dividends that tax cuts promise and rarely produce at the scale required, the spending cuts that governments announce and the organized constituencies of beneficiaries consistently prevent. The resolution will arrive through the specific mechanisms that the history of government debt consistently demonstrates: the slow erosion of inflation, the forced adjustment of market pressure, the demographic reality that eventually makes the arithmetic of pay-as-you-go systems impossible to ignore, and the occasional genuine political leadership that, in specific moments of crisis, with specific political will, achieves the reforms that normal democratic politics makes impossible. The debt that democracy built is not going away. It is too large, too structurally embedded, and too politically defended to disappear through any plausible combination of fiscal responsibility and economic growth, but it will change. It is already changing, through the inflation of the past several years, through the fiscal adjustments that market pressure has forced on the most indebted developing economies, through the pension reforms that aging demographics have made unavoidable in several European countries, through the slow and unglamorous work of institutional improvement that independent fiscal councils, improved accounting standards, and better public financial management are gradually achieving. The process is not dramatic. It does not have a climax or a resolution scene. It is the specific, slow, contested, imperfect, and genuinely difficult process of democratic societies grappling with the specific consequences of choices their predecessors made, and making new choices whose consequences their successors will inherit in turn. The debt that democracy built will be paid by democracy, gradually, imperfectly, with considerable political conflict about who specifically pays and when and how much. That is both the honest answer and the only realistic one. The bill comes due eventually. It always does, and it is always, in the end, paid by people who had no vote when it was run up, which is either the deepest injustice of democratic fiscal policy or the specific mechanism through which each generation takes responsibility for the world it inherits from the last, probably honestly both.